Hello, everyone. Welcome. Let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat, please. If you've watched Booklarder talks before, you know the drill and how much I enjoy this part. So thank you for indulging me. I'm in Seattle. Where are you? Don't be shy. Thank you, Raj. Raj is in Austin. Sue, hello in Seattle. Chicago, hi, welcome. Dan's in Cheltenham. Seattle, good morning. We'll let a couple more people get tuned in here and then we'll get started. Michigan, welcome. Tina in Seattle, welcome, Tina. Reykjavik, Iceland, hello, welcome. DC but lived in Ballard. Well, thank you for joining us. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Laura Hamilton. I have a cookbook shop here in Seattle, Washington that's called Booklarder. We are doing some in-store cooking classes and author talks right now, all masked up and all those good things. But we are continuing to do author talks on Zoom. And I actually think that even when the pandemic is officially over, whatever that means, we will continue to do those in situations like this, where we have an interviewer in another country and or the interviewer and the author in two different countries, and we're here in Seattle, and it's just easier to do it this way. And we can welcome all of you from all over the world. So I don't see these going away. Thank you for being here. I am delighted to welcome Dan Saladino today. He is a BBC food journalist and author of this fantastic new book, Eating to Extinction, The World's Rarest Foods and Why We Need to Save Them. He is going to be in conversation with food activist, author, and filmmaker Raj Patel, most recently filmmaker of Stuffed and Starved. They are going to talk about the book. They are, of course, going to also leave time for questions. So if you could please use that little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for your questions. We will get to as many of those as we can in the last sort of 15 minutes or so of the talk. The talk's also being recorded, and so if you have to drop off early or you want to watch it again later or share it with friends, it will be on our YouTube channel within the next 48 hours, and that is just Booklarder on YouTube. You can support the author talk by purchasing a copy of the book. Dan was kind enough to send us signed book plates, and so you will get his signature right there on the half title page. And I will drop a link to purchasing the book in the chat to make that easy for you. All right, so let's get started. Thank you so much for being here, and please join me in welcoming Raj Patel and Dan Saladino.
Thanks very much, Lara. And Dan, it's lovely to see you. Now, I'm going to step out of the way in just a second. But before I do, I do want to let folk know that this is definitely not a book to read on an empty stomach. Dan's one of the very few humans on Earth who's had the chance to eat some of the planet's rarest foods. And so it would be awkward if then the descriptions in the book were all like, oh, it tastes a bit like chicken. But the joy of Dan's writing is that it leaps off the page and it is mouth-wateringly good. And so what I thought we might do is, Dan, if you wouldn't mind, but perhaps just give us a sense not just of the joy of your prose, but also a sense of why it is that that we ought to be caring about the world's most endangered foods, with one by perhaps reading just an excerpt from one of the opening chapters, one of my favorite examples from the Hadza community. I wonder if you might jump in with that, Dan, and then we'll get talking.
Most definitely. So to set the scene, I was in Tanzania, near Lake Eyasi, and I was spending some time with the Hadza, who are some of Africa's last hunter-gatherers. There are around 1,000 Hadza left, and only 200 of them practice no form of agriculture. So 200 of them are purely hunting and gathering. And while I was with them, we went hunting. So I watched them find porcupine and dig tunnels and disappear underground in search of porcupine for meat that was taken back to camps. But probably the most memorable experience was with them in the savannah in search of honey. And the savannah it includes baobab trees, very extremely tall and long-living trees, and the bees' nests where you find the honey are very difficult to find. It can take a Hadza hunter hours and hours to find a bee's nest. So they have a partner who helps them find the honey, and this partner was introduced to me by a young hunter-gatherer called Sigwadzi. And so I'll just read an extract from the book about what happens next as we move into the savannah away from the camp in search of honey. I was led by a young man named Sigwadzi. As he walked, he whistled. This wasn't a melodious tune, more a series of angular ups and downs on a musical scale, each passage finished with a high-pitched twirl. To my ears, there was no obvious musical pattern to follow, but something in the bush was paying close attention to his whistle. Noticing movement above the trees, Sigwadzi broke into a sprint, weaving through the scrub and around baobab trees as he continued the whistle. A wordless conversation was underway, an exchange between a human and a bird. Sigwadzi looked towards the flutter of activity in the canopy, and there, perched on a branch, was an olive grey bird the size of a starling. Barring a few flashes of white on its tail, the bird looked plain and unassuming, but after a few more whistles from the hunter, it revealed itself to be exceptional. A kek came its reply to Sigwadzi's whistle, signalling that a deal was on. The bird had agreed to lead the hunter to honey hidden among the branches of the giant baobabs. These trees are as wide as they are tall, living for up to 1,000 years, fed by a root system so deep that they can access water in periods of extreme drought. Finding a bee's nest concealed among the baobab's tall branches can take a hunter-gatherer several hours as they need to inspect tree after tree. With the assistance of a honey guide, it takes a fraction of that time. The bird's scientific name captures its talent perfectly. Indicator, indicator. Somehow, over hundreds of thousands of years, the two species, humans and honey guides, found a way of sharing their different skills. The bird can find the bee's nests, but can't get to the wax it wants to eat without being stung to death. Humans, meanwhile, struggle to find the nests, but armed with smoke, can pacify the bees. Theirs is the most complex and productive of any partnership between humans and wild animals. And there we are. And
No. I mean, it's and I wonder if you could just share. I mean, for folk who have yet to read the book, but I know you will, and you'll soon be buying it from the Book Larder. But you've got 35 of these different foods that you go through. What happens at the end of your quest for honey? What is it that you end up eating? Because it's not just honey; it's honey and something else.
Yeah. So. What then happens is Sigwadzi climbs the tree with the smoke, and although he's being stung, he starts to throw down handfuls of honey to the other hunter-gatherers below, and they scoop up the honey and put it into their mouths, and I share in some of this. And not only is there the honey, but also the larvae wriggling away, and also the crunch of some of the bees that are trapped in the honey as well. So this is a high energy, high protein food. What's interesting is that there are some anthropologists and ethnobotanists who have looked into the relationship between humans and the bees and the baobabs. And it's possible that one of the foods that made us human, or made us what we are with our big brains, it was honey. So meat gets a lot of attention because of the archaeological record of stone axes. The evidence for honey is it doesn't really survive, so it's faded away. But the idea that this high energy, high protein food was incredibly important is reflected in the Hadza's relationship with the food. It's their number one food. It's their favorite food. And again, anthropologists have spent time with the Hadza and studied this. And yeah, it's above meat, above all the plants and tubers that they forage for.
So I mean, this is a story about relationships ultimately, and I wonder if you could just give us the pitch. Well, why are so many foods becoming endangered? What's the sort of what's changed in humans' relationships with what we eat that so much of it is now becoming so much of it's going away?
Yeah, and I wanted to start this story of endangered foods, and at the other end of the equation, the uniformity and the homogeneity that's spreading around the world in terms of agriculture and food. I wanted to start that story with the Hadza because not only does it point back to an important part of our evolution as humans, and that the most successful lifestyle to date in our history as a species, which is hunting and gathering, but also the intimate relationship the Hadza have with nature, that their awareness of biodiversity can be seen in conversations with children as young as 4 or 5 who know the many of the potential menu of 800 different plants and animals that they have, and the life cycles of the animals they hunt, and also the seasons as they change, and the plants that come and go. And I wanted to start with that intimate relationship because it's one that many of us around the world have lost. And I wanted to tell the story of how, in pursuit of abundance, in pursuit of calories and energy, that we have created farming systems in which we believe we were clever enough, powerful enough to override nature and ignore some of the complexity that nature has. And when in the case of the major staples, wheat, rice, maize, and so on, how we had managed to spread them around the world and lose huge amounts of not only biodiversity but agro biodiversity as well. So within all of the foods I look at in the book, it's the story of how diverse each crop is, or each animal breed was, and how that diversity came into existence over thousands and thousands of years of farming, and how in a really short space of time that diversity has been lost again in that race, that quest for abundance and more and more calories, but at what cost is one of the other questions I explore in the book.
Well, and so one of the things you also explore is strategies for coming back from the brink, which in some cases ironically perhaps involves eating the things that are that are being rendered extinct. I wonder if you could just sort of tell us a story about the middle white pig, which I mean it's emblematic of many of the sort of arcs of taste that we're encouraged to jump aboard. But what tell us about the middle white pig and why you like it so much.
So the book is broken up into 10 parts. Each part is a different food group, and so the Hadza belong in wild food, and then I move into cereals, and which takes us into the birth of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent and in southern Mexico and in China. In the meat section, I wanted to tell the story of the middle white pig because it again, it's emblematic of the homogenization that's taken place in livestock, and also the way in which animals became commoditized. So, and in a sense, the book also, with each of these foods, goes into deep history. So I talk about the origins of wheat and maize, and I talk about the origins of humans domesticating animals as well. The story of the pig is fascinating because there are two main routes of domestication. One happens in China, where there's again, talking of intimacy, a really close relationship between humans and pigs. Pigs were almost like the waste disposal units for farmers, and obviously a storage of energy, and so the pig would be slaughtered at a time of great need. So again, this one of the themes in that section of the book is how precious and how rare meat was. But there was a separate line of domestication which came out of the Fertile Crescent and then ends up in Europe. And I tell the story of the coming together of these two waves of domestication only in the 18th and 19th centuries, where farmers in Britain particularly were coming up against a bit of a brick wall of productivity. Because of the way in which the European pig had been domesticated, it was more wild than the Asian pig. And so the Europeans brought in Asian pig genetics and created the breeds that we now think of as being traditional European and British pigs, but they were super productive. But what then happens is the huge diversity that existed, because each region had its own pig adapted to the different food sources and environmental conditions. There's almost like a competition, an intense competition underway in Europe for the pork business, and Britain is losing out to Denmark because Denmark has more productive breeds. And so what unfolds in Britain is the search for the best, most productive, fastest growing, best feed conversion, and it ends up being this large white pig. Now, the middle white was the preferred pig of people in Britain at the time, and it was a smaller pig. It was kept in the houses, or not in the houses, but it was kept in the households of working class people in London and in the north of England. And again, it was like a waste disposal unit, but it was also something that was prized and revered. Slowly the large white becomes commercially important, and then not only does it dominate British pork production, it goes on to dominate global pork production because it's so efficient, and it's imported or brought in by farmers in America, who then do even more work with the genetics of the pig and make it super abundant. And we end up in the situation that we're in today, where we have these really intensive systems where the pigs aren't really allowed to move, but the way in which they convert feed, soy and other grains that we grow, that pig is the pig that then dominates the world. And I also tell the story of the mass slaughter of pigs in China in recent years because of the spread of disease. And again, one of the big themes in the book is the way in which we are now challenged, our food supply is being increasingly challenged by the spread of disease and the genetic uniformity of many foods, whether that's crops or in this case, the pig. And in the case of China, they slaughtered almost half the pig population there, which was a big chunk of the global pig population. So again, this isn't just about quaint traditions, and isn't it nice to have these breeds? I'm just flagging up how the system that we've arrived at has been highly productive for a very short space of time, but it's fragile, and there isn't a huge amount of resilience in that system. Well, sorry, Raj, sorry, but the middle white pig, the pig that then became, as in Britain, became as endangered as a panda, I tell the story of a farmer who used to produce the most intensive kind of beef, who then fell in love with these old breeds and almost single-handedly has saved the middle white breed, so the one that lost out to the large white. And again, it's these backyard farmers and these small-scale farmers in across Europe, in the States, elsewhere, who have saved the more than 7,000 now endangered livestock animals.
I mean, what struck me about that story was, the farmer calling the slaughterhouse saying, can I have some of my pigs to eat? And they laugh at him and say, no, they're good for sale. They're not good for eating.
Yeah.
And I think that the idea that we eaters get stuff that even slaughterhouses don't think is fit for you. I mean, they're like, oh yeah, sure, we'll sell that to you, but we wouldn't touch it ourselves. Is the story of the alienation of humans from our food system. That in fact it's to go back to the ideas of the origins of gastronomy. For the people in the slaughterhouses, this food wasn't nice to think about. It wasn't nice to imagine eating. It was just nice to think about as a commodity that you could make money off. But you would never in any way think of this as food. You just think of this as stuff that other people are unfortunate enough to want. And so that's that idea, I think, is very interesting, because part of what you're saying is rekindling a connection to actually wanting to eat things.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the work of Upton Sinclair in The Jungle, really, taking his readers into that world as well, of the slaughterhouse and food that was hardly palatable, and the story you mentioned of the farmer in the book. Yeah, I mean, in that case, they grew too quickly, and they were so young, and and again, there are many issues attached to that. But the answer that came back was that they don't taste of anything. And and many of the stories in the book, when it comes to animals and meat, it's again this long history. I'm thinking about the Hadza and the Honey Guide. This relationship between humans and animals is one in which our ancestors wouldn't recognize the systems we created today, because the pig wasn't just a pig that produced pork for consumption. It was part of a cycle that they depended on. And likewise with cattle, converting pasture that we couldn't consume. So energy from the sun, creating pasture that would be then eaten by the cattle that would then produce milk and cheese. These animals were too precious to kill with such abandon, in a way. And and there's many stories in the book that almost certainly when I was writing them, made me stop and think, wow, I mean, it just, again, in such a short space of time, how we've changed and distorted our relationship with food and nature.
But one of the ways you talk about at least trying to put some sort of brakes on the sort of willful extinction of vast numbers of species, is the Svalbard seed vault, which it looks like a sort of spaceship has crashed into the Arctic Circle. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and then I'm going to ask you about what you were up to at Kew Gardens yesterday.
Yeah, well, Svalbard is, as you say, it's in the Arctic Circle. It's on an island just on the west coast of Norway. It was the idea of somebody who I talked to in my research for the book, Kerry Fowler, who has dedicated his life and his career to preserving crop diversity. Kerry Fowler has been inspired by botanists whose work spans a century. So there was the Russian botanist Nikolai Vavilov, followed by an American botanist called Jack Harlan. Vavilov and Harlan were both raising this as an issue over many decades, saying to feed the world in the future, we need crop diversity because it gives us options for the future. The plants and animals that we are losing have traits that we might need in terms of drought or higher temperatures or colder temperatures or lack of rainfall. And Carrie Fowler, it was almost the inheritor of these ideas, and spread around the world are hundreds of different seed banks. Some of them are small, some of them are in places of conflict, some of them are under-resourced. Carrie Fowler wanted to create a place in which the world's most valuable genetic resources could be stored away and would be secure, that if in the event of them being needed by crop breeders, they could be called on and they were safe and backed up in the vault. And in the case of the conflict in Syria, where many of the seeds have been lost, Svalbard has been put into use for that reason. But it's important to bear in mind that it's almost like you can see it as the record of our agricultural history. So the seeds and the crop diversity that your ancestors and my ancestors and everyone watching this have created and developed by saving seed after seed, season after season, and as those plants adapted to those various conditions, Svalbard is the library in a way of all of that genetic diversity. But that's all it is. It's stored away in a cold temperature, ready as backup. I think one of the important things to bear in mind is that we still need these crops to be planted in fields by farmers. And also, for cultural reasons, for reasons of local economies, regional economies as well. So, I mean, I think it's a good thing to have them stored and backed up, but it's not the solution to the risks we're facing in losing diversity.
No, I mean, I agree with you, and there are. I do think it's important to have these crops not just sort of kept in sort of in vitro, sort of under glass, up in the Arctic Circle, as a sort of hedge against climate change, particularly when, unfortunately, because the permafrost is melting in the Arctic Circle, they're now having to run coal-fired generators to pump the water out of Svalbard in one of these sort of bitter ironies. As you say, and as you observe right at the beginning of the book, the only way that was it Inspector, the honeybird,
indicator,
indicator,
a honey guide bird,
yes. But I mean, the only reason that this bird is able to thrive is through relationships, right? And there's something very important about keeping cycles of life going, rather than sort of preserving in aspic the evidence that there were people smarter than us and we've rendered them extinct, which is why I was very interested in your discussion about coffee beans. So I wonder if you could explain to folk who may not know this, why coffee beans aren't the sort of thing that do well in Svalbard.
Yeah, it's there are a number of important crops, and coffee is one of them. You cannot really store away in seed banks and seed vaults. The seeds don't remain viable, and so this is why living collections are important. And there are living collections of all kinds of plants around the world. So where I am in the UK, there is Brogdale, which hosts the National Fruit Collection. And so you go to Brogdale and there are acres and acres or hectares of apple and pear trees grown in pairs as a living collection. And likewise, coffee cannot be stored. So what we do have in the case of coffee, when it comes to coffee diversity, are the wild almost like the center of origin, as Vavilov would have called it, or the center of diversity, as botanists call it today, the living natural collection of wild coffee trees in southwestern Ethiopia. So the kind of the origins of coffee itself. And there is where, because of that's where the plant originated, that's where most of the genetic diversity still exists. But as coffee plants then spread around the world, they diversified, they adapted to different conditions, and communities also selected what they preferred. So there was a cultural preference as well. And so coffee is fascinating because we now depend on two species of coffee, Arabica and Robusta. Arabica is the coffee that has dominated global trade for 400, 500 years. Robusta came along in the 19th century as a coffee species selected because as the name implies, it's more robust than Arabica. Arabica in the 19th century really suffered from a disease outbreak, which meant that huge coffee plantations in Asia, including Sri Lanka and India, were wiped out. And again, this is a warning from history because it devastated the livelihoods of farmers. It led to wide-scale migration as well. So Robusta is introduced. What we're now finding is that there are projections from botanists who are saying that if we see climate change happening as we expect it to, Arabica is a very fragile plant and it won't tolerate climatic change. And so we need to find diversity. And hopefully in this, as well as the two species I've mentioned, there are 130, we think around 130 species of coffee. And I tasted one yesterday, Liberica, which was, again, a big coffee at the beginning of the 20th century, but really the way in which the trend throughout the book is that we focus in on the really successful, most high yielding, and we sacrifice diversity to that. Liberica became an obscure coffee, apart from in the Philippines. And meanwhile, there's one in Sierra Leone that was tracked down by botanists, which is supposedly more delicious than Arabica, more tolerant to disease as well, but it was wiped out by deforestation. So the race is on now by coffee experts to find the few trees that remain of some of these viable coffees and perhaps bring them back and make the global coffee crop more diverse.
There's a theme here where the crops that do well, or the products that do well, are the ones that survive transportation, that are robust, that have thick skins, that take on waxing well, that can be gassed into ripeness at the right time, or whatever it is, depending on the crop. And what I particularly enjoyed about the book was that you're not just looking at the things that people kind of know and love, like apples or bananas or whatever it is, though you do talk about those in new and exciting ways, but also you're thinking about microbes. And I was very pleased to think with you in this book about how English cheese grows up and matures in tandem with roads. I wonder if you could just sort of tell us a little bit about how the road system in the UK sits alongside the sort of sale and trucking of hard cheese before we start talking about Stilton, which I think is important for this crowd to hear.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is one of those stories where I think a lot of people will assume that many of the cheeses, the so-called territorial cheeses, and by that I mean cheddar, Lancashire, Stilton is one of them as well. That they go back way back in our history, and to some extent cheese making obviously does. But what really happens in the with these cheeses is they are cheeses of the Industrial Revolution, really. And as you mentioned, the creation of road networks and also the train network as well, which meant that parts of the country that aren't that productive in terms of whether it's factories or arable crops have lots of pasture and rain. So the southwest of England, for example, what it means is that the energy that's being produced there in the form of milk and cheese can quickly be moved into urban centres such as London or Birmingham. And that's why it's in the industrial period that we end up with these traditional cheeses that are mostly hard cheeses, are transportable, but actually do still have a regional identity as well. And so those are the cheeses that we have as our traditional cheeses. And but at the same time, because of this movement of both cheese and milk, what we also see is the spread of disease. So there are diseases that people are dying of in 19th century England, mostly because of the transportation of liquid milk into cities, excuse me, and also the production of liquid milk in very densely populated urban areas. This is why pasteurization becomes such an important technology mostly in the early part of the 20th century. But not only is liquid milk pasteurized at that point, so does cheese become pasteurized as well. And the important distinction is cheese making involves a process of the buildup of lactic acid bacteria, which actually does render these products relatively safe. So, but because of the technology arriving and then obviously production and scales up, wartime has a huge impact as well. So the government gets involved and controls milk distribution and cheese production. So we end up with one cheese during Second World War. And by that point, because of the closure of many of the factories, we see the extinction of most traditional cheeses, the rise of pasteurization, and you could see it also as the extinction of many of the microbes that we coexisted with, which originate in pasture and also the breeds of animal and the milk. And actually, we're living in a very interesting time of an emerging science of the gut microbiome, where we are only glimpsing the importance of microbial diversity on our physical and mental health.
I want to get to that, but just because this is a group of people convened by a bookstore that is very interested in food, I just wanted to observe first that you can and should stick your questions in the Q&A area. We'll get to those in a second. Second, yeah. That actually, you know, one of the best-selling books of the 1800s was by a guy called Friedrich Christian Accum, and he had something with this snappy title. I'm going to read it all. It was a treatise on adulterations of food and culinary poisons, exhibiting the fraudulent sophistications of bread, beer, wine, spirituous liquors, tea, coffee, cream, confectionery, vinegar, mustard, pepper, cheese, olive oil, pickles, and other articles employed in domestic economy, and methods of detecting them. So, you know, this just gets to your point, Dan, that you know, the foods that traveled had alongside them a certain kind of moral panic around, are we being poisoned? And now we find ourselves recognizing that in our bid to sterilize things, we have denuded ourselves of some of the microbiome, the microbiome that we need in order to thrive. Now, before we dive into some of these questions, Friday Elliott's just going nuts in the Q&A, and I'm very pleased that you are, because one of the questions you're asking is one that was on my mind, and I want you to sort of close the circle here. We spoke earlier on about, well, you know, what we could do is develop tastes for things like the middle white pig and you know, screw the big one. But this can backfire. And in particular, in your discussion of tea, the newfound interest in pu'er tea, for example, has had some unintended consequences. I wonder if you could talk to us about those.
Yeah, well, again, fascinating history in that this was the original tea. So, and the story begins in southwestern China, a real biodiversity hotspot around the world. So many of our foods in terms of fruits and other plants originate in that part of the world, one of which is these spindly tall trees that produce the leaves that we then turn into tea. And historically, what we used to do was, well, not we, but the indigenous people of the area would be to dry and ferment and heat the leaves and pack them into cakes. And these cakes were a way in which the tea could be stored and preserved in some cases for years. And they would also ferment. So flavors would develop in these blocks of tea, which look like hockey pucks, but really dark in color in some cases, and they would be taken along the tea road. So we're familiar with the Silk Road, but there was a tea road in which these cakes of tea traveled around the world. Into the 20th century, we have the communist revolution. We have the right through to Mao's Great Leap and Cultural Revolution. Pu'er, and this is what the tea is called because of this region, the Pu'er region, falls into decline. And modern teas, so the teas that we're more familiar with, dominate. And then there's huge amounts of deforestation. China wants to become self-sufficient in rubber as more people are driving cars, for example. So there's deforestation. We lose lots of these wild trees, tea trees. And but fast forward to the 21st century, pu'er then becomes fashionable. And modern pu'ers, but also some of the pu'ers that were made at the beginning of the 20th century being auctioned for millions of dollars. And what we then see is this frenzy by which there are tea collectors and tea brokers and traders heading into these remote villages. And actually that becomes quite destructive because there are cases in which there were fake pu'ers being traded within the villages. There is environmental impact of the numbers of people who are going into these villages, and as is often the case, the people who are losing out when the tea went into decline, but also when the tea became a fashionable commodity, it's the indigenous local people. And so now the most prized pu'er teas are never consumed by the local people. They become I guess prized by some of them, the most powerful and rich and influential in modern day China and across Asia, because there is now this lucrative market in pu'er, whether it's authentic or not.
That's interesting. Well, that kind of story is one with which your book is rich. And Friday is asking both of us, which I think is very nice of you, Friday. Thank you. What's one butterfly effect impact of food business evolution over time that you've encountered in your studies that might surprise us? Invasive species or a shift in the local economy. Talk to us about unintended consequences, Dan, and then I've got a story.
Yeah. Well, that question actually introduces a fascinating subject of invasive species. So if you think, there's the story of the oyster, the native European oyster in the book, but also actually there were many different types of oysters that existed and many in the Americas as well. Over extraction. So again, oysters in 19th century London, it was like the McDonald's of street food, and it was affordable, cheap, and so the amount of oysters that we took from the waters across Europe was huge. We pollute, obviously, industrial revolution as well, and post, and for the 100 years that follow, we pollute the waters. And so these native oysters go extinct or become extremely endangered. And what then happens is growers who used to depend on those oysters introduce the what we call the rock oyster or the Pacific oyster from Asia, and then they proliferate, and they are spreading through the waters in many parts of the world as well. So again, something that is, it's a natural product, the Pacific oyster, but even under the sea, we are seeing a kind of a story of homogenization as these unique, diverse types of oysters have gone extinct, and we're seeing this spread of homogenization of this Asian Pacific rock oyster.
I mean, that story of homogenization and how you counter it is something, certainly, I mean, when I was writing Inflamed with my co-author, Rupa Maria, is a medical doctor, and we were looking at food systems around the world. And observed that first, in the global north, in cities, in Europe and North America and other parts of the rich world, our microbiomes are severely denuded. And so our guts are not as diverse as they used to be. And the lack of diversity is usually associated with inflammatory disease, everything from inflammatory bowel syndrome to Alzheimer's, which is now increasingly being understood as an inflammatory disease. All of this is sort of connected to what's going on in our guts, and that's as a consequence of this sort of sterilization of food, of the transport of the long tail of the Industrial Revolution that you were talking about, Dan. But unfortunately, one of the ways to treat that is through the microbiomes of indigenous communities who haven't made the mistakes that we have. And so there's a treatment that's being tried out that involves essentially eating the poop of indigenous people, particularly of the Yanomami community that lives in southern Venezuela and northern Brazil. They have incredibly rich microbiomes, rich biodiversity within their guts because they live with rich biodiversity all around them. And the sort of unintended consequence here is stealing the poop in the same way that, what one can imagine Vavilov stealing seeds from indigenous communities to put them away for safekeeping, while the indigenous communities themselves go extinct. And so this idea of disconnection from the web of life that licenses the theft of seeds from indigenous communities, for safekeeping, is also now licensing the theft of shit from indigenous communities. And the problem is it works. When you do ingest this poop, it has been shown to fight off everything from C. diff to irritable bowel syndrome to Crohn's disease. And it's a sort of miracle cure that comes at the expense of intruding into one of the few sort of uncontacted areas that still remain in the global south. So it's a very dark unintended consequence.
And I am aware of. I mean, there were people when I was researching the HADs, there were people who had these so-called fecal transplants because of the fact that there are some microbes in the gut microbiome of the HADSA that have gone extinct in Western guts that are being seen as important and essential to long-term health. So it's a fascinating area, and it's interesting to actually think about the ethical issues attached to that as well.
Well, people are asking all kinds of questions. I was just pointing behind me to this inflamed poster. Someone's asking, is that a seed behind you? Is that a cocoa pod, by the way, Dan? That's on the shelf.
Actually, yeah. So one of the chapters in the book towards the end, so in part 10, I tell stories of foods that have become endangered through conflict. And I traveled to Venezuela back in 2017, which was a period of incredible instability in Venezuela. But I met a woman there called Maria Fernanda de Jacobi, who wanted to revive the fortunes of Venezuela through cacao. Cacao had made Venezuela one of the most I guess important economies of that part of the Americas, and it was the source of most of Europe's chocolate in the 18th century and 19th centuries. But oil then arrives in the 20th century as a tradable commodity, and so the cacao production falls into decline. This was given to me by a woman, and it's a ceramic cacao pod, and she was the first, I think, one of the first women in Venezuela to produce what we refer to as going from bean to bar. So she was growing cacao and also producing these delicious chocolate bars from the rare genetic types of cacao they have still in Venezuela. And so I prize this because, again, it was a story. She broke down to me as she was telling me her story because, such was the level of economic collapse. People had gone onto her farm, stolen her equipment, even taken the cacao from the trees as well. So, I mean, she was a real pioneer, an extremely brave woman as well. So that's an important, gift.
Yeah. So Dan, as we come to the end of our time together, I'm aware that there are a few questions really just sort of asking, well, what do we do? Is it that we buy things like puer, or we don't buy puer, or is it we have to shop for extinct things, or is that a bad idea? What can consumers do?
Well, I think one thing is to know the story, and this is why I wrote the book, is because I think we need to understand what we mean by diversity and what's out there and who's out there saving things as well. Secondly, you mentioned this disconnect that we have, and I think a lot of your work, Raj, has been about this disconnection that we have and the way and the economics of food as well. I think it's possible now to make closer connections to food producers. And there's a story of a rare rice in China, for example, a red-tipped rice that goes back to the origins of rice itself. And I went in the middle of nowhere, just on the a couple of hours drive from Chengdu in the southwest, and I was thinking, how on earth does this farmer sell his rare rice to people? How does he make a living? And he got out his phone and he showed me this thing called WeChat, and he was selling his rice to people who were engaging with him in Beijing and in central Chengdu as well. I think we can make links, and in the words of Slow Food, become co-producers with farmers and food producers and have a meaningful relationship with them. And also we can, there are community projects where I live, community orchards, where people are saving diversity, not on their own, but as groups of people who are preserving trees and helping to save them as communal assets. And we can lobby schools. I think Copenhagen has an example in which public procurement, so the means by which institutions and public bodies buy their food and their supplies, diversity in Copenhagen schools became one of the criteria by which they bought in food. And in Brazil, surprisingly, they had a target of a third of all food sold in schools had to come from a local farm. So I think there are really concrete ways in which we can make a difference.
Well, let's dig into that just a little bit. And again, Friday, thank you for more of these questions. A question to both of us is, what's a lovely and hopeful example of humans in the world of agriculture acting with kindness and compassion and in looking towards the future? Well, let me answer that first so that you get the last word. The example that comes to my mind is the restoration of dams, is getting rid of dams. And what that does is make it possible simultaneously to have the restoration of things like beavers. So on the American West Coast, near where y'all are in Seattle there, to have wetlands that are managed with beavers means not just the restoration then of a rich biodiversity that happens because beavers are much better hydrological managers than humans will ever be, but also beavers herald the return of salmon. And salmon means you have healthy waterways, you have trees that are nourished by the chemicals that that have their origins, or the minerals that have their origins in the sea and make their way up the streams. And if you sort of look at the biochemistry of these huge redwoods, you'll find the sort of chemicals that have come through the bodies of salmon in them. For me, something that's very hopeful about people thinking towards the future is knocking dams down so that we can begin the work of restoring not just ecosystems, but our sort of humility in the face of them. And I think that's incredible and vital work if we're to stop the endangerment of the many foods that you talk about so beautifully in the book, Dan. But talk to us about what you find hopeful as we as we are in this very dark moment.
Yeah, well, there is a story of, there are a couple of stories, but I'll choose one of them, of foods that actually did go extinct that have been brought back. So there's a farmer in southern Germany, and it's the most humble food of all, really, and one that, you'd be surprised that anyone would get excited about, but it's about a lentil. And this farmer in the region of Swabia, which is quite remote, it's quite mountainous, quite difficult to farm. So it's not as if you would make a great living as a wheat farmer or be able to feed yourself that easily. But they could, and they did for centuries, with a type of lentil that grew there. It went extinct in the 1960s when Canada turned on the supply of lentils and became, the world's biggest producer of lentils. And, Germany was industrializing as well after the war. It went extinct, and he mourned this and mourned it for 20 years, thinking, I want to bring this lentil back. And he searched in every seed bank he could make contact with, and found no trace of it at all, and ended up traveling to Russia to go to the Vavilov Institute, just to see if they had something that was close to this particular lentil, and went there with a group of farmers, and managed to, he then realized on inspecting the archive that they actually did have this Swabian lentil, but it had been filed under the wrong name. And so if you go online and search for Swabian lentil, and Wold Mammal is his name, there's a picture of him with his arms raised, cheering as he's found this lentil. And you might think, well, why would anyone be so excited about finding a lentil? Well, for him, it represented an entire way of life and a way of farming, because they intercrop the lentil with other crops. It meant that it fertilized the soil, and they grew wheat and barley alongside it as well. He invented technology which meant that they could sift out the different grains as well. And I've tasted a lot of lentils in my time, and it is special. It's so delicious. And the reason why the story is so important is that the story of the rescue of this extinct Swabian lentil was then found its way to Sweden, where people did likewise, and they looked at what used to grow here in terms of legumes, and they recovered some of the lost crops there of peas and beans. And in the UK, a young group of people started to research, how do you feed Britain in the future if we are challenged with energy and resources? They discovered that in the Iron Age, we were growing fava beans here in the UK. And inspired by that German story, they have brought back some of those legumes as well. So again, I hope, or I like to think, the book is full of these optimistic stories that we can make a change.
Do you see that happening? I think. Sorry.
I mentioned, coffee. I was at Kew yesterday. Kew, which is basically where some of the world's leading scientists, crop scientists, are, and they're thinking about what are we going to lose with climate change. And I was tasting this coffee, and they were saying that we want to bring this, we are working with governments to bring these coffees back. It is happening. The UK government is investing in research into diversifying wheat, so to bring some of the genetics lost in modern wheat back by researching the wild ancestors of wheat. This is happening, and I talk about the Green Revolution and this post-war transformation of the way we farm. If we can do it then, we can do it. If we did it then, we can do it again in the 21st century, and have a big shift in the way we think about how we produce food, and not just how we produce food, but what we produce.
Well, Lara, I see you're there to take us home, but very quickly, Dan.
Go ahead.
Friday gets full satisfaction. Milk first or tea first when you're pouring tea?
There is only one answer.
There are many teas I enjoy with. There are many teas I enjoy without any milk, but I can't imagine how you could drink a cup of tea with milk and not have tea first. So you know what you're working with. I mean, yeah.
Friday, no, all due respect, thank you so much for these questions, and thank you so much, Dan, for a lovely conversation.
Thank you so much, Raj. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Raj and Dan. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. As I mentioned, the talk was recorded. My Zoom, for the first time in 2 years of doing this, crashed in the middle of it. I don't know if that was obvious, so hopefully that didn't mess up the recording, but if it did, I'll fix it. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Again, Dan's book is Eating to Extinction. I also dropped a link to Raj's latest book, which if you're going to pick it up, please consider bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores. And thank you so much, both of you, for this. It was such such a great conversation. And again, Raj, you said, don't read this when you're hungry. Don't listen to this talk when you're hungry either. That's all I have to say. I'm ready to go have coffee and eat honey and all those things.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Stay safe and healthy, everyone. Take care.